You are about to experience Jackson Snyder Presents. Direct from the Vero Essin Yahad, a Hebrew Nation radio original program. JSP is a variety show seeking out Jewish and Christian origins, religion, theology and history, and doing so in a fashion that is both educational and entertaining. Welcome to Jackson Snyder Presents.
What happened in Eden? An alternative translation tells a very different story. This from ancientorigins.net. All modern concepts of the Garden of Eden stem from a few verses in the biblical book of Genesis, none of which is entirely free from ambiguity. The ancient Hebraic documents, from which the early part of the book is compiled, contain simple and basic writing with very few vowels, and none of the modifying inflections which, later, gave flexibility to the language. The absence of vowels lead to this ambiguity, which is why, even today, after millennia of scholarship, no one knows how the name of Elohim was pronounced. As a result, we believers vary in our interpretation of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh between the sounds of Yahweh, which I use, and those of Jehovah or Yehovah, and these are only two possibilities. We're divided on the name of our mighty Elohim. Another source of ambiguity lies in the fact that early Middle Eastern languages leaned heavily on paronomazia to give variety to simple phrases, a form of punning, which allowed several different meanings to be given to a single set of symbols. In speech, it's probable that slight inflections of tone differentiated between meanings, but in the written word, there's no such indication to help us. And modern students of the Bible, like their predecessors, have to guess at the meanings of many words from the angle of their own preconceived notions of the context. In all three of the basic ancient Middle Eastern languages, Hebrew, Sumerian, Babylonian, a scholar with a secular bias would produce a different translation of the same text from that produced by a scholar with a religious bias. This may be very easily illustrated. The quintessence of the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis may be summarized in 4 well-known quotations. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:26, God said, let us make man in our image, in the likeness of ourselves. Genesis 2:8, Yahweh, God, planted a garden in Eden, which is in the east. And Genesis 5:24, Enoch walked with God, then he vanished, because God took him. These 4 widely used quotations are taken from the Jerusalem Bible, first published in 1966, from deeply researched and modernized translations of the Dominican Biblical School in Jerusalem. We consider this magnificent work to be the most authoritative and scholarly of all the modern translations. And yet these simple phrases, which hold the fundamentals of present-day Jewish and Christian teaching, are beset with traps of which the average believer knows nothing. We shall open our bag of doubts by discussing 3 of them. In the first 3 verses, the English term God is taken from the Hebrew term, that is Elohim, while in the 4th, this term is expanded to Ha Elohim, in which Ha is the Hebrew equivalent of the. The problem here lies in the fact that Elohim is the plural form of El, and if El originally meant God, then Elohim should mean gods, and Ha Elohim should mean the gods. This plurality is emphasized in our second quotation, in which the English singular and plural are strangely mixed. God said, let us make man in our image, in the likeness of ourselves. The Jerusalem Bible attempts to extricate itself from a very difficult situation by appending a footnote, and here it is. it is possible that this plural form implies a discussion between God and his heavenly court, that is, the angels. Alternatively, the plural expresses the majesty and fullness of God's being. The common name for God in Hebrew is Elohim, a plural form. Thus, the way is prepared for the interpretation of the fathers who saw in this text a hint of the Trinity. With all respect to the Jerusalem Bible's editors, we find this statement as eclectic a piece of reasoning as we have ever met. In essence, what these editors are saying is, the common name for God in Hebrew is Elohim, a plural form, whereas what they really mean is, the common name for Elohim in English is God, a singular form. We argue about this all the time. And what if the Hebrew is correct and the English is wrong, as we suspect may be the case? In a situation such as this, it would not be unreasonable to choose the Hebrew original as the more likely solution rather than the later translation. It's true that elsewhere in this chapter of Genesis, the pronouns referring to the deity are singular, but this is not unusual in early Middle Eastern languages, where the plural is frequently implied. But nearly always, and there are over 30 cases, the noun is in the plural, Elohim. The odd exceptions are where it was necessary to refer to specific singular entities, such as El Shaddai, El Roi, or El Elyon. In the early definitive chapters of Genesis, as we have them in biblical form, something is clearly wrong. The singular, El, Aleph, Lambda, is a very ancient word with a long etymological history, and it has a common origin with many other ancient words in other languages, all with a common significant meaning. The Sumerian El meant brightness or shining. The Akkadian ILU meant the bright one. The Babylonian ELLU meant the shining one. The Old Welsh ELLYL meant a shining being. The Old Irish AILLIL meant shining. The English ELF means a shining being, from the Anglo-Saxon word elf, AELF. The Old Cornish El meant an angel. All these terms indicate shining or brightness, and consequently, it is our thesis that the Hebrew El needs to be translated in the first place not as God, but as the shining one. And the plural Elohim, a contraction of Ha Elohim, responsible for so much activity in the early part of Genesis, requires translation as the shining ones. If we apply this translation, the four quintessential quotations become, "In the beginning, the shining ones created the heavens and the earth. The shining ones said, 'Let us make man in our image, in the likeness of ourselves.' Yahweh, the leader of the shining ones, planted a garden in Eden, which is in the east. Enoch walked with the shining ones, then he disappeared, because the shining ones took him away." The Old Testament doesn't tell us specifically who or what these shining ones were, but fortunately, the ancient Sumerian records do, and also certain alternative Hebrew documents which are not well understood by biblical scholars. Another trap we can mention here lies in the Hebrew word that has been translated as the heavens. This was Hashamim, a plural form indicating the skies. Like the Sumerian term on, which could be used for skies or for high places, the Hebraic Shem could also mean the heights. And Shem was also the root of a word meaning plant or vegetation. In the context of the garden in Eden, and the descriptions of this which will follow, we believe that Hashemaim originally meant the highlands, and the planted highlands at that. Similarly, Haaretz, which the Jerusalem Bible translates as the earth, is capable of being translated as the ground or the land, preferably so. In comparison with Hashemaim, we believe it should have meant the lowlands. The most important problem in these translations, however, after the elucidation of Elohim, lies in the Hebrew word bara, which is translated as created. And there would be no reason to challenge this if it were not for the parallel Sumerian and alternative Hebraic versions which are to follow. The term bara is only used for created in the sense of a creation by God. Otherwise, it can mean such things as cut down timber, clear ground, or fatten oneself. And if Elohim doesn't mean God, but the shining ones, we ought to look at alternatives. The phrase in that first quotation could have meant the shining ones cleared the ground or felled timber in the highlands and the lowlands, because according to the Sumerian record, that's exactly what they did. But there is another interesting alternative. In Hebrew, the letter bet at the beginning of a word is frequently proclitic. That is, it appears to be an integral part of the word, but is really a form of modifying prefix. The actual word starts at the letter immediately after the initial bet. In its power to modify, it can indicate pleasure in verbs of perception or seeing, and ra is the root of the Hebrew word to see. Consequently, it would be perfectly justified in the circumstances to transcribe bet resh aleph not as bara, but as bara'ah. The latter would mean looked at with pleasure. Such an interpretation would alter the first quotation to, in the beginning, the shining ones looked down with pleasure on the highlands and the lowlands. If the Sumerian account is to be believed, that is exactly what these shining ones would have done, because they're recorded as having descended onto the top of a commandingly high mountain, from where they would have been able to see the land in which they were ultimately to settle. What a kettle of fish that is. We remember in Enoch that the shining ones, those who watched what was going on, those who rebelled against authority with pride, were cast down onto the top of Mount Armon, breaking the top of the mountain and coming out the bottom through what we could now call the mouth of Baal, the huge cave on the side of Mount Hermon, which is located at Banias in North Galilee, not far from Caesarea Philippi. Did watchers actually form the creation that we know? If that translation is correct, and it sure could be, where did such shining ones come from, if this wasn't just completely a legend? I leave that to you. This little article is an extract from the chapter Eastward in Eden in the book The Genius of the Few, the story of those who founded the garden in Eden by Christian O'Brien and Barbara Joy O'Brien. If you have this book, I would sure like to get some information from you about it.
Do you concur?
I concur.
I concur.
I concur.
I concur.
I concur.
Concur.
I concur.
And I dig a pygmy.
Affirmative. Keep this under your hat until an announcement is made.
You have been listening to Jackson Snyder Presents on Hebrew Nation Radio.